Wrapped in blue tarp, tangled in the gnarled roots of a fallen tree, she lay silent. Not with the peace of the dead, but with the chilling stillness of a secret drowned in the cold waters of the Willamette River. This was the scene that shattered the quiet dawn in Corvallis, Oregon, on November 12, 1998. A young woman, vanished just days before, her absence a whisper now turned into a deafening scream. The mystery that followed would become a wound on the town's soul, a labyrinth with no discernible exit. Before we dive into this chilling story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Now let's step back into the silence of 1998. The dawn of November 12, 1998, broke over Corvallis, Oregon. Not with the promise of a crisp autumn day, but with a profound, almost suffocating silence. A thick glacial fog, churned by the cold air meeting the temperate currents of the Willamette River, hung heavy and low, reducing visibility to mere feet. The familiar contours of the evergreen-lined banks, the distant hum of the highway, all were swallowed by the shroud, transforming the mundane into something spectral and unnerving. For Gerald Mackenzie, a man whose existence had been inextricably bound to the river for nearly 5 decades, this morning was unsettlingly different. He knew every ripple, every submerged log, every prime fishing spot where trout were known to linger. Yet today, an almost preternatural stillness permeated the air, a chilling premonition that something profoundly amiss awaited discovery. Mackenzie, his weathered hands steady on the tiller of his small aluminum boat, navigated with an innate sense of direction, his breath pluming in the frigid air. His destination was a particular bend in the river, where a massive cottonwood tree had recently succumbed to the elements, its sprawling, gnarled root system creating a natural labyrinth of shelter for fish. As he edged closer to the bank, the oppressive fog began to thin in wisps, momentarily revealing patches of the murky riverbed and the chaotic tangle of the fallen trees' exposed roots. He cut his small outboard engine, allowing the gentle, almost imperceptible current to guide his boat into position. It was then, amidst the matted leaves, fine sediment and waterlogged branches, that he saw it. An anomaly, a shape that defied the organic contours of the river's natural debris, partially obscured by a swath of faded industrial blue tarp. His eyes, accustomed to discerning the subtle movements of fish beneath the surface, focused with a terrifying clarity. What first appeared to be the unnatural curve of a shoulder, then a distinct limb, became horribly, unequivocally human. A form, trapped and held by the merciless, unforgiving grip of the tree's ancient roots, barely visible beneath the churning, opaque surface of the water. The blue tarp, once a functional covering, now served as a grotesque and chilling shroud, doing little to conceal the horrifying truth. The quiet resolve that typically defined Mackenzie's demeanor shattered. A raw guttural cry born of sheer terror and disbelief tore from his throat, echoing eerily across the muffled river, an isolated sound in an otherwise silent world. His fishing rod, a familiar extension of his arm, clattered to the floor of his boat, forgotten. With hands trembling uncontrollably, he fumbled for his marine radio, his fingers numb with cold and burgeoning horror. His voice, when it finally emerged, was a strained, barely coherent whisper, thick with shock and a desperate urgency, as he relayed the unthinkable coordinates to the Benton County Sheriff's Office. The initial dispatch call, terse and urgent, quickly escalated through the channels, sending ripples of profound disbelief and dawning dread through the sleepy town of Corvallis. Within minutes, the distant, mournful wail of sirens pierced the oppressive mist, growing steadily louder as patrol cars, emergency vehicles, and an ambulance raced towards the coordinates Mackenzie had provided, their lights a frantic, pulsing beacon in the grey morning. The arrival of the first responders broke the profound stillness, their flashing blue and red lights cutting through the pervasive fog, painting the somber landscape with an urgent, surreal glow. Uniformed officers, their faces etched with grim determination and a visible unease, moved quickly to secure the area. Yellow crime scene tape, stark against the muted greens and browns of the riverbank, was hastily erected, creating an immediate, stark barrier between the horrifying reality unfolding on the water and any approaching onlookers. The air grew heavy, thick with the unspoken gravity of the discovery, a palpable sense of dread and disbelief settling over the small gathering of law enforcement personnel, paramedics, and forensic technicians. The sheer impossibility that such a horror could befall their quiet, insulated community was almost as chilling as the scene itself. The body, that of a young woman, was retrieved with painstaking care, a delicate and meticulous process complicated by the treacherous grip of the tree's root system and the frigid, unyielding river water. Forensic technicians, working quickly against the encroaching cold and the elements, documented every detail of the scene. The blue tarp that had partially concealed her was carefully noted, its specific hue, texture, and the way it was haphazardly wrapped, all meticulously catalogued. The detritus of the river, fine silt, small stones, fragments of waterlogged leaves and twigs, clung to her, a chilling testament to the time she had spent submerged, lost to the current. Each piece of debris, no matter how insignificant it seemed, was painstakingly collected, a potential, invaluable clue in a puzzle that had only just begun to form its macabre outlines. Hours later, the formal identification came through: Rachel Monroe. The name resonated with a quiet, melancholic familiarity throughout Corvallis, a town where most knew their neighbors, if not by name, then by face. 26 years old, Rachel was a beloved substitute teacher at the local elementary school, a woman known for her easy, genuine smile, her gentle demeanor, and her quiet, somewhat reserved nature. She was a familiar sight on the winding trails that crisscrossed the Willamette River banks, often lost in thought during her solitary walks, finding solace in nature. The news of her identification hit the community with a second, brutal wave of shock. How could someone so universally liked, so seemingly innocent and withdrawn, meet such a horrific and violent end? Her disappearance had been reported just 3 days prior by her close friend and colleague Linda Parker. Linda, a vivacious woman whose outgoing personality perfectly complemented Rachel's quiet grace, shared a bond of sisterhood with Rachel that went beyond mere friendship. Linda had become increasingly concerned when Rachel failed to show up for their planned dinner on November 9th. Rachel was, to a fault, a creature of habit, meticulous in her planning and utterly dependable. For her to simply vanish without a word, to miss a long-standing engagement, was utterly unlike her. Linda's initial phone calls went unanswered, escalating quickly from mild concern to frantic worry, culminating in a desperate report to the sheriff's office. Linda's testimony painted a vivid portrait of a friend who had simply, inexplicably ceased to be, leaving behind a void that resonated deeply. The timeline of Rachel's last known movements began with her leaving her small Corvallis apartment on the afternoon of November 9th, ostensibly to run errands at the local market. She was never seen alive again. Her distinct green Honda Civic, a vehicle easily recognizable in the small town, was discovered a day after her disappearance. It had been found abandoned on a secluded dirt road several miles outside of Corvallis, nestled within a thicket of dense foliage that effectively hid it from casual view. A local farmer checking fence lines had stumbled upon it. The car was locked, and an initial meticulous inspection by crime scene investigators revealed no overt signs of forced entry, broken glass, or a struggle within the passenger compartment. Inside, a single grocery bag containing a few mundane items lay on the passenger seat, alongside a crumpled, unread note and a cassette tape labeled Autumn Mix 97. These meager artifacts offered no immediate clues to her fate, merely deepening the sense of unease and solidifying the perplexing nature of her disappearance. The note, unfolded carefully, contained only a grocery list, unremarkable and ordinary. The cassette tape, a compilation of 90s alternative rock, offered no obvious connection to anything sinister. They were remnants of an ordinary life, abruptly and violently interrupted. The subsequent autopsy, conducted by the state medical examiner with meticulous precision, delivered a grim and detailed account of Rachel's final moments. The report meticulously documented distinct marks consistent with manual. The town of Corvallis, once a bastion of quiet predictability, found itself plunged into an unprecedented state of pervasive fear. The brutal murder of Rachel Monroe shattered any illusion of safety, ripping through the community's tranquil facade. Homes that had once remained unlocked, welcoming to neighbors and friends, now had bolted doors and drawn blinds after dusk. Parents curtailed their children's outdoor playtime, their laughter from neighborhood parks replaced by a tense, wary silence. Neighbors eyed strangers with suspicion, and even familiar faces seemed to carry a newly unsettling ambiguity. The tranquil Willamette River, once a source of recreation and peace, now loomed in the collective consciousness as a silent, menacing guardian of a horrific secret. The serene woodlands, once places of solace and comfort for Rachel, now whispered of lurking danger, transforming into something sinister and foreboding. Sheriff Tom Riley, a seasoned lawman whose face was a roadmap of decades spent policing the quiet stretches of Benton County, found himself at the helm of an investigation unlike any he had ever encountered. His usual calm demeanor, a hallmark of his steady leadership, was now underscored by a grim resolve, a heavy burden of responsibility for the peace and safety of his community. Beside him stood Detective Marcus Holloway, a bright and ambitious young officer, only 28 at the time. Holloway's initial enthusiasm for police work, fueled by a nascent desire to bring justice to victims, was now tempered by the stark, brutal reality of this senseless crime, his first major murder case. The experience was hardening him, showing him the darker underbelly of humanity he'd only read about in textbooks. The initial stages of the investigation were a whirlwind of frantic activity and frustrating dead ends. A task force was immediately assembled, comprising local deputies, state police detectives, and forensic specialists from neighboring counties. They canvassed the entire area, meticulously interviewing anyone who might have seen Rachel in her final days, anyone who had been near the river or the secluded dirt road where her car was found. Every grocery store clerk, every gas station attendant, every resident of the rural routes was questioned. Yet credible leads were scarce. No eyewitnesses to a struggle. No clear motive presented itself. The metallic blue paint fragments remained an isolated, inexplicable detail, stubbornly refusing to connect to anything concrete. Riley, surveying the burgeoning fear in his community and the baffling absence of concrete evidence, famously articulated the profound sense of hopelessness that settled over Corvallis from the very beginning. He described the case with a weary sigh as a labyrinth with no exit. It was a sentiment that would echo for decades, encapsulating the profound sense of despair and unanswered questions that followed Rachel Monroe's murder, a chilling narrative of a cold, unsolved crime that slowly began to fade from the town's collective memory, yet continued to haunt its soul, leaving a permanent scar on the landscape and its people. The initial fervor of the investigation eventually gave way to a grinding, slow-burn inquiry, but the killer remained elusive, a ghost in the fog, leaving only pain and unanswered questions in their wake. The brutal discovery of Rachel Monroe's body on November 12, 1998, did more than just shatter the serene facade of Corvallis, Oregon. It plunged the entire community into a state of profound, unrelenting dread. The initial shock, a sharp collective intake of breath, quickly gave way to a creeping paranoia that settled deep within the town's collective consciousness. What had been a safe, idyllic haven suddenly felt like a place where shadows held menace. Families that had always left their doors unlocked, a testament to the community's trust, now found themselves bolting locks and drawing curtains even before dusk. The innocent laughter of children, once a common soundtrack to afternoons in neighborhood parks, diminished, replaced by a tense quiet as parents kept their little ones closer, confined to the perceived safety of their homes. Small businesses, the lifeblood of Corvallis, felt the chilling grip of fear. Foot traffic dwindled, especially after sundown. The casual camaraderie that once permeated coffee shops and grocery aisles evaporated, replaced by wary glances exchanged between strangers. Everyone became a potential victim, or worse, a potential suspect. Conversations in local diners, once filled with gossip and local news, were now dominated by hushed speculative whispers about the crime. Theories, wild and unsubstantiated, proliferated like weeds after a spring rain. Some whispered of a transient passing through, a drifter who had brought evil into their midst. Others feared a serial killer, a monstrous presence waiting in the shadows. There were even darker suggestions of a jilted lover or a vengeful acquaintance, painting a grim picture of betrayal. The lack of answers fueled an insatiable hunger for explanations, however far-fetched. In the wake of Rachel's murder, the forests surrounding Corvallis, once cherished for their beauty and tranquility, transformed into sites of desperate collective effort. Volunteer search parties, organized by anxious townspeople and guided by exhausted law enforcement, combed through the dense undergrowth for weeks, They scoured the banks of the Willamette River, meticulously searched Adair Park, and pushed deeper into the vast silent woods. Men and women, armed with flashlights and a grim determination, called out Rachel's name into the cold, empty air, hoping against hope to find a discarded item, a clue, anything that could break the suffocating silence of the case. But their efforts, though valiant, yielded nothing substantial. The forest, like the river, seemed to guard its secrets with an impenetrable silence. Among those most deeply affected was Linda Parker, Rachel's closest friend. Linda's vivacious spirit, once a source of light, was now dimmed by a profound, agonizing grief. Days turned into weeks, and her initial hope for swift justice curdled into a bitter frustration with the agonizing lack of answers. She made frequent, desperate visits to the Benton County Sheriff's Office, her eyes red-rimmed and pleading, seeking any scrap of information, any sign of progress. She would sit across from Sheriff Tom Riley, her voice often breaking, asking the same questions over and over. "Have you found anything new? Do you have any leads?" Her pain was raw, a constant reminder of the life brutally cut short. The sheriff, a man hardened by years of police work, felt the weight of her anguish, recognizing in her pleas the frustration of an entire community. Linda clung to the faded photographs of Rachel, her smile a cruel mockery of the tragedy. Her own life, once intertwined with Rachel's, now felt incomplete, scarred by the void left behind. The uncertainty, the not knowing, was a torment that gnawed at her every waking moment. Early in the investigation, a name emerged that captured the attention of Sheriff Riley and Detective Holloway: Ethan Ward. At 29 years old, Ward was a local mechanic, a somewhat quiet man who ran a small, unassuming garage on the outskirts of town. His connection to Rachel Monroe was seemingly innocuous, yet it warranted scrutiny. Just 2 weeks before her disappearance, Rachel had brought her green Honda Civic to Ward's shop for a routine oil change and a minor brake issue. This seemingly innocent transaction placed Ward within Rachel's orbit during a critical period, making him a person of interest. The detectives summoned Ethan Ward for questioning. The interrogation room at the Benton County Sheriff's Office was Spartan, designed to be impersonal. A metal table, 2 chairs, and a single, unblinking overhead light. Sheriff Riley, his face impassive but his gaze sharp, sat opposite Ward, while Detective Holloway, still relatively new to major crime investigations, took notes, observing every subtle shift in Ward's demeanor. Ward, dressed in clean but worn work clothes, presented himself as cooperative, if a little nervous. He answered their questions calmly, describing his interaction with Rachel as purely professional. He remembered her car, the distinctive green Civic, and confirmed the dates of service. "So, Mr. Ward," Sheriff Riley began, his voice even, "you had contact with Ms. Monroe just before she went missing." Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir. Just a routine service. Oil change, checked the brakes. She picked it up October 27th. Did you notice anything unusual about her? Anything she said?" Holloway interjected, his pen poised. Ward paused, seemingly deep in thought. "No, not really. She was always polite. Smiled a lot. We just talked about the car." The questions then shifted to the night of Rachel's disappearance, November 9th. Ward maintained a solid alibi. He claimed he had been at the Riverbend Tap House, a popular local bar, with a group of friends, watching a Monday night football game. He rattled off the names of several individuals who could corroborate his story. Detectives Holloway and Riley meticulously cross-referenced Ward's alibi. They interviewed each of the friends Ward had named separately, asking specific questions about the evening. The friends, all consistent in their accounts, confirmed Ward's presence at the Riverbend Tap House for the duration of the evening in question. The bar manager and several other patrons also placed Ward there, eliminating him from the immediate time frame of Rachel's abduction. This corroborated alibi was a significant hurdle. Furthermore, a comprehensive forensic sweep of Ward's garage and residence yielded no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. No blood, no fibers, no trace of Rachel Monroe was found. Crucially, the microscopic metallic blue paint fragments found beneath Rachel's fingernails, a detail that still baffled investigators, did not match any paint type found in Ward's garage or on his personal vehicle. His car was an older, faded red pickup truck, and his shop primarily dealt with standard automotive paints, none of which had the distinctive metallic blue composition. Without any physical evidence to contradict his alibi, and with no other leads pointing directly to him, Ethan Ward, much to the frustration of the investigation team, had to be released. He remained a person of interest, a shadow on the periphery, but for the time being he was beyond their reach. The stagnation of the case weighed heavily on both Sheriff Riley and Detective Holloway. Riley, a man who prided himself on solving every major case that had crossed his desk, felt an unfamiliar, corrosive sense of failure. He would often spend late nights alone in his office, poring over crime scene photos, rereading witness statements and staring at the evidence board, which remained stubbornly barren of connections. The metallic blue paint fragments, meticulously labeled in a small evidence bag, mocked him from their position on the board. He saw the grief in Linda Parker's eyes, the fear in the townspeople, and the unresolved anger that simmered beneath the surface of Corvallis. Each dead end was a fresh stab of frustration. Holloway, still in the early stages of his career, felt the crushing pressure intensely. He had thrown himself into the investigation with youthful vigor, determined to bring justice to Rachel. He followed up on every anonymous tip, every whispered rumor, every speculative phone call. He walked the riverbanks, retraced the route to Rachel's abandoned car countless times, hoping to see something, anything that had been missed. But the case remained an impenetrable wall. He saw the weariness in Riley's eyes, the quiet resignation that was beginning to settle over the veteran sheriff, and it fueled his own personal torment. The labyrinth with no exit was a phrase that began to haunt his own thoughts. As weeks bled into months, the initial fervor of the investigation began to wane. The task force, once a bustling hub of activity, slowly disbanded. Resources were reallocated. The constant media attention, once a source of pressure, gradually faded into infrequent mentions. Rachel Monroe, once a vibrant, living presence, began to transform in the town's collective memory. She became a melancholic remembrance, a tragic photograph fading. By 2001, nearly 3 years after Rachel's murder, the case of Rachel Monroe had officially gone cold. The files were archived, meticulously organized but gathering dust, awaiting a breakthrough that seemed increasingly unlikely. It was around this time that Ethan Ward, the local mechanic who had once been a prime suspect, quietly packed up his life in Corvallis. His garage, once a fixture on the edge of town, was sold. He severed his ties with friends and acquaintances, leaving behind no forwarding address, no clear explanation for his departure. He simply vanished, fading from the collective memory of Corvallis as subtly as the fog on the river, leaving behind no discernible trace. His quiet exit at the time was largely unnoticed by a town still struggling to come to terms with its own unresolved tragedy. Most assumed he had simply sought a fresh start, away from the shadow of suspicion that had briefly fallen upon him. Nobody suspected the truth. For nearly 3 decades, the cold case of Rachel Monroe had lain dormant, a thick layer of metaphorical dust settling over the files in the Benton County Sheriff's Office archive. The pervasive fear that once gripped Corvallis had over time receded, replaced by a quiet collective amnesia, a town's desperate, perhaps unconscious, attempt to bury its pain and move forward. Rachel Monroe herself had receded into a distant, melancholic memory, her name associated less with her vibrant life and more with an unresolved tragedy, whispered only in hushed, regretful tones. The small brass plaque by the river, a quiet memorial, stood as the only stark reminder of the violence that had once ripped through their peaceful community. But time, while it had dulled the sharp edges of grief and obscured the immediate pain, had also inexorably advanced the frontiers of science. And in March of 2025, that relentless scientific advancement ignited a flickering ember of hope, destined to reignite the darkest shadows of Corvallis's past and exhume a truth long buried. The Oregon Cold Case Unit, a specialized task force dedicated to cracking intractable, unsolved murders across the state, made a pivotal decision. They would officially reopen the Rachel Monroe investigation. This wasn't merely a bureaucratic formality or a symbolic gesture of remembrance. It was a strategic move, meticulously planned and driven by the exponential leaps made in forensic technology since 1998. The year 2025 offered capabilities in DNA analysis that were utterly unimaginable nearly 3 decades prior. What had once been deemed insufficient, degraded, or entirely irretrievable, microscopic fragments of biological material, minuscule cells that held genetic blueprints, could now be coaxed into yielding critical, undeniable genetic information. The scientific landscape had undergone a revolution, transforming forensic science from a blunt instrument into a finely honed surgical tool. At the helm of this renewed, modern effort was Detective Marcus Holloway, now 55 years old. The ambitious, eager young officer from 1998, whose initial optimism had been so brutally crushed by the labyrinth with no exit, had matured into a seasoned, methodical lawman. His face, etched with the lines of years spent navigating the grim realities of violent crime, bore the quiet authority of experience. The failure to solve Rachel's murder had haunted him for 27 years, a persistent, gnawing ache that no amount of professional success, no number of other solved cases, could entirely quell. He had carried the vivid image of Rachel's faded photograph and the profound, lingering grief in Linda Parker's eyes as a deeply personal burden. Now, as the highly respected chief of the cold case unit, the Monroe file was one of the first he personally pulled from the dusty archives. The old files, brittle and yellowed with age, felt heavy in his hands, each page a testament to the unsolved mystery that had so profoundly shadowed his early career. To a constant, silent reproach, Holloway understood implicitly that this time, success would hinge not just on traditional police work and interrogations, but on cutting-edge science. He knew they needed the absolute best in the field. This conviction led him directly to Dr. Eleanor Graves. Now 62, Dr. Graves was widely recognized as a preeminent forensic analyst, a true luminary in the highly specialized domain of cold case forensics. Her reputation preceded her. She possessed an almost intuitive ability to extract, amplify, and interpret genetic material from the most degraded, seemingly useless samples where others had failed. Her state-of-the-art laboratory, a sterile symphony of advanced machinery, pristine workstations, and meticulous organization, was considered the vanguard of forensic science, a place where the past could be meticulously, scientifically resurrected. When Holloway presented Dr. Graves with the Monroe case, he watched her eyes, sharp and intelligent behind her spectacles, intently scan the initial evidence reports. He observed her silent, focused absorption of the minute details, particularly the long, puzzling fragments that had baffled investigators in 1998. The challenge here, Detective Holloway, she stated, her voice calm and authoritative, yet underscored by a quiet intensity, isn't just DNA extraction. It's making sense of what little we might find after all these years. And then, crucially, finding a match. Her dedicated team, a small, highly specialized unit of equally brilliant technicians, thrived on precisely these kinds of challenges, viewing them not as obstacles, but as intricate scientific puzzles demanding elegant solutions. The crucial turning point for the reopened investigation lay in 2 seemingly insignificant pieces of evidence, meticulously preserved in the original evidence locker, sealed and untouched for 27 years. A single, almost invisible hair strand found beneath Rachel's fingernails, and the microscopic sliver of metallic blue paint, also retrieved from her nails during the initial autopsy. In 1998, the hair, lacking a root follicle, was dismissed as useless for traditional DNA analysis, merely a trace fiber. The paint fragment was an intriguing curiosity, a documented but ultimately isolated detail without a match to any known source, a frustrating dead end. But 2025 was a dramatically different era of forensic science. Dr. Graves's team began their painstaking work. They employed advanced mitochondrial DNA analysis on the hair fragment, a groundbreaking technique capable of extracting genetic profiles even from hair shafts without follicles, relying on the DNA inherited maternally. The process was agonizingly slow, incredibly painstaking, and demanded absolute, unwavering precision as they sought to isolate minute amounts of severely degraded DNA from the ancient sample. Days bled into weeks as the highly skilled technicians worked in a meticulously controlled, sterile environment, battling potential contamination and the sheer fragility of the decades-old biological material. Simultaneously, The microscopic metallic blue paint fragment was sent to a specialized materials lab. There, state-of-the-art spectrometry and electron microscopy could perform a detailed elemental composition analysis, providing a unique chemical fingerprint far beyond the primitive capabilities of 1998's technology. They sought to identify the exact chemical signature, the unique blend of polymers and metallic flecks that might finally reveal its origin, tying it to a specific object or industry. The initial results from the DNA analysis, though complex and requiring careful interpretation, were astonishing. A partial DNA profile, remarkably robust given the age and degradation of the sample, emerged from the hair fragment. It wasn't a complete, fully comprehensive profile, but it was robust enough to work with, a beacon of light in the long darkness. The next critical step was to cross-reference this newly obtained genetic data with national criminal databases, primarily CODIS, Combined DNA Index System. Holloway, pacing the pristine floors of Dr. Graves's lab, held his breath, but the initial search yielded no direct match to an individual within the system. This meant the perpetrator, if their DNA was indeed in the database, hadn't been arrested for a previous crime that had warranted DNA collection, or they were simply not in the system for other reasons. The disappointment was palpable, but momentary. Dr. Graves, ever pragmatic, had anticipated this outcome. No direct hit. "Detective," Dr. Graves informed Holloway, her expression unreadable, her voice measured. "But this is not the end of the road. It merely indicates we proceed to the next more intricate phase, genetic genealogy." Genetic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that had transformed numerous cold cases, involved comparing the unknown DNA profile to vast databases of publicly available genetic data, typically from consumer DNA testing services like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe, albeit with strict privacy protocols and legal safeguards. This method allowed forensic geneticists to identify distant relatives of a suspect, thereby creating a reverse-engineered family tree that could, eventually, lead them to the perpetrator. It was like casting a wider, more intricate net, using familial connections as guideposts. Dr. Graves's team uploaded the partial DNA profile to several approved open-source genetic databases, meticulously comparing it to millions of anonymized genetic markers. Seeking familial links, however tenuous, the search algorithms whirred, processing immense, unprecedented amounts of data, tracing lineage through generations, then a series of matches, not direct matches to the perpetrator, but to a constellation of distant relatives, some as far removed as third or fourth cousins. With each new connection, Dr. Graves's team painstakingly began to construct a sprawling family tree, working backward through generations to identify common ancestors, then moving forward meticulously branch by branch to narrow down slowly, painstakingly through the convoluted branching paths of the reconstructed family tree. A familiar name began to surface, a name that caused Marcus Holloway's blood to run cold, resurrecting ghosts he thought he had buried decades ago. The genetic links, cross-referenced with demographic data and historical records, led them inexorably to a specific family line, and within that line, a particular surname began to appear with increasing, undeniable frequency. And then the confirmation. The partial genetic profile pointed unequivocally, with startling certainty, to a distant relative of one. Ethan Ward Holloway stared at the luminous screen in Dr. Graves's lab, the name Ethan Ward flashing before him, almost accusatory in its stark clarity. The same Ethan Ward, the local mechanic, 29 years old in 1998, who had fixed Rachel's car, who had been questioned extensively, and then, to the profound frustration of the initial investigation team, released due to a seemingly solid alibi and the maddening absence of physical evidence. The very man who had quietly disappeared from Corvallis in 2001, fading from memory like a phantom. The revelation hit Holloway with the force of a physical blow, a sudden sharp jolt of vindication intertwined with a chilling, sickening sense of what if. 27 years, the feeling of a personal burden finally, agonizingly lifting, of a deeply held professional torment finally finding its target, was almost overwhelming. Yet it was tempered by the chilling realization that the culprit, the man who had stolen Rachel's life, had been under their noses all along, a ghost in plain sight, The tension in the cold case unit's office became palpable, thick with anticipation. The resurrection of a name so familiar, so frustratingly close to justice decades ago, charged the atmosphere with a potent mix of disbelief, anger, and a burning resolve. The meticulous, patient work of Dr. Graves and her brilliant team had achieved what countless hours of conventional police work in 1998. The genetic genealogy breakthrough provided the Oregon cold case unit with a name, a ghost from the past that suddenly materialized into a chillingly tangible lead: Ethan Ward. The laborious process of tracing an individual who had actively sought to disappear for over 2 decades began immediately. Detective Holloway's team, working in conjunction with national law enforcement databases, obscure property tax records, social security registries, and even outdated employment records, meticulously cross-referenced every piece of information available. The digital breadcrumbs, faint as they were, eventually led them across state lines, a methodical pursuit spanning hundreds of miles. They discovered that Ethan Ward had indeed left Corvallis in 2001, but he hadn't vanished into thin air. He had simply rebranded himself, adopting the new identity of Ethan Collins, and relocated over 500 miles southeast to a small unassuming town nestled in the remote, forested expanse of Idaho. It was a place remarkably similar to Corvallis in its quiet, isolated nature, a choice that now seemed chillingly deliberate. This new identity, however, was not impenetrable to modern investigative techniques. Holloway dispatched a covert surveillance team to Idaho, comprised of 2 veteran detectives renowned for their patience and discretion. Their mission was precise: locate Ethan Collins, establish his daily routines, observe his habits, and discreetly obtain a DNA sample, a process that required absolute stealth and minimal risk of alerting their target. The Idaho town, with its single main street and sleepy pace, was a mirror image of the Corvallis Ethan had abandoned, providing a deceptive sense of tranquility. Ethan, now 56 years old, his once dark hair flecked with gray, lived a seemingly unremarkable life as a self-employed carpenter, maintaining a small cluttered workshop behind a modest, nondescript house on the quiet outskirts of town. He kept to himself, rarely socialized with neighbors beyond a perfunctory nod, and his daily routine was a picture of predictable solitude, almost as if he were deliberately trying to remain unnoticed. For 3 painstaking days, the surveillance team maintained a constant, unobtrusive watch. They observed him working diligently in his garage, the faint hum of power tools a constant backdrop. They tracked his infrequent trips to a local hardware store for supplies and his routine visits to a small, family-run diner for lunch, always sitting at the same counter stool, always ordering the same special. The cold, calculated opportunity they had been waiting for finally presented itself on the 3rd morning. Ethan, after purchasing his usual black coffee from a drive-through window, absent-mindedly tossed the paper cup into a public waste bin situated just outside the diner before heading directly to his workshop. Within minutes, one of the surveillance detectives, feigning a casual stroll, approached the bin. With a quick, practiced motion, he retrieved the discarded cup, carefully placing it into a sterile evidence bag. It was a seemingly innocuous piece of litter, a forgotten remnant of a morning ritual, but for the cold case unit it contained a treasure, a direct, uncontaminated source of Ethan Ward's current DNA. The detective felt a surge of adrenaline, a profound sense of holding justice, however symbolically, in his gloved hands. The precious sample was immediately express-flown back to Dr. Eleanor Graves's state-of-the-art laboratory in Oregon. The tension that filled the cold case unit's offices during the wait was almost unbearable, a palpable energy humming in the air. Holloway, normally a picture of stoicism, found himself pacing his office, the ghosts of Rachel Monroe and the unfulfilled promise of justice pressing in on him from every yellowed page of the case file. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was the definitive moment. 27 years of agonizing questions, of frustrated leads hinged on this single coffee cup. Dr. Graves understood the gravity. Her team, accustomed to high-stakes analysis, worked with an accelerated yet meticulously precise protocol, isolating and amplifying the genetic material from the discarded cup with absolute focus. The confirmation came swiftly, but the hours of waiting had felt like an eternity. Dr. Graves's voice, When she finally called, Holloway was calm, professional, yet carried an undeniable weight of profound finality. "Detective Holloway," she stated, her voice resonating with quiet authority, "we have a conclusive match. The mitochondrial DNA profile extracted from the sample collected in Idaho is a 99.98% match to the mitochondrial DNA found on the hair strand beneath Rachel Monroe's fingernails. The statistical probability is astronomical." Holloway gripped the phone, his knuckles white against the black plastic. The numerical precision of the match was absolute, leaving no conceivable room for doubt, no lingering possibility of error. A surge of grim satisfaction, a sense of deep personal vindication, intertwined with a profound sorrow for the decades of injustice, coursed through him. He closed his eyes, picturing Rachel's face, then the cold, unyielding waters of the Willamette River. "The lake will finally speak," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, a long overdue vow not just to Rachel Monroe, to the grieving town of Corvallis, but also to the younger, more naive officer he once was, burdened by an unsolved crime. The agonizingly prolonged hunt had yielded its quarry. With the undeniable DNA confirmation in hand, the cold case unit moved with swift, decisive action. An arrest warrant for Ethan Ward, alias Ethan Collins, was secured without delay, charging him with the premeditated murder of Rachel Monroe. A multi-agency task force, comprising Holloway's detectives and local Idaho law enforcement, converged on Ethan's unassuming workshop on a quiet Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, deceptively peaceful, mirroring the false calm of that fateful November morning in 1998, 27 years prior. As the unmarked vehicles pulled up, silent and strategic, their occupants moving with practiced stealth, a scene unfolded that would forever be seared into the minds of the arresting officers. The faint, sweet smell of sawdust and freshly cut wood, mingled with the faint chemical tang of paint, hung in the air around the workshop. Through the wide-open double doors, Ethan Collins, now a man of 56 with noticeably graying hair and a distinct stoop to his shoulders, was visible. He was hunched over a sturdy workbench, his calloused hands moving rhythmically, sanding a large, unfinished wooden door. The fine dust motes danced and sparkled in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the workshop's interior, creating a deceptively idyllic tableau. But it was the color of the door that froze the officers for a split second, a chilling, visceral confirmation of the dark truth they had come hundreds of miles to unearth. It was a vibrant, undeniable, almost luminous metallic blue, the exact distinctive metallic blue, the very same impossible hue that had been found in microscopic fragments beneath Rachel Monroe's fingernails 27 years ago. An enigmatic, mocking detail that had haunted Holloway. Personally, for decades, the arrest was quick, precise, and professional. Ethan, startled by the sudden, unexpected influx of armed officers, dropped his sanding block with a clatter onto the concrete floor. His face, initially blank with confusion, quickly contorted into a mask of disbelief, then a thinly veiled raw terror as Detective Holloway, his own expression grim and unyielding, stepped forward. "Ethan Ward," Holloway announced, his voice firm and resonant, "you're under arrest for the murder of Rachel Monroe." Ethan's eyes, wide with sudden, sickening comprehension, flickered to the metallic blue door, then back to Holloway's steely gaze. A profound, chilling recognition dawned in their depths, a silent admission of guilt that needed no words. The interrogation began hours later in a stark, sterile room at the local Idaho police station, deliberately devoid of any comforts or distractions. Ethan Ward, now stripped of his assumed identity and the anonymity he had meticulously cultivated, sat opposite Holloway and another detective, his posture slumped. He was no longer the somewhat nervous, cooperative mechanic of 1998, but a man aged by time, by the weight of a hidden crime, and by the abrupt shattering of his carefully constructed facade. Holloway, methodical and relentless, laid out the evidence with surgical precision. He described the irrefutable DNA match, the intricate process of genetic genealogy that had led them to him, the single telltale hair strand, and then, with deliberate emphasis, the metallic blue paint fragments found on Rachel Monroe's body. He presented the case as an undeniable scientific certainty, leaving no space for ambiguity. Ethan, however, maintained a stoic, albeit increasingly agitated, denial. "I don't know what you're talking about," he insisted, his voice raspy, barely above a whisper, his gaze darting nervously between Holloway's unwavering stare and the scuffed linoleum floor. "I never hurt anyone. I don't know any Rachel Monroe. You've got the wrong man." His denials, however, were betrayed by a clear cascade of nervous tells that Holloway, a master of interrogation, observed keenly. His right eye twitched almost imperceptibly but constantly. His hands, once steady on the carpenter's workbench, now clenched and unclenched convulsively under the interrogation table, and a faint sheen of cold sweat appeared on his brow, despite the cool temperature of the room. The composure he tried desperately to project cracked under the relentless weight of the presented evidence, revealing the raw fear beneath. He mumbled about being mistaken, about false accusations, about circumstantial evidence, but offered no coherent counter-narrative, no plausible explanation for the overwhelming scientific certainty that had been meticulously assembled against him. As the interrogation continued, a separate team, armed with a meticulously executed search warrant, meticulously processed Ethan Ward's house in Idaho. Every corner, every hidden space was thoroughly examined with forensic precision. The upper levels of the house were sparsely furnished, almost eerily clean and meticulously organized, devoid of any significant personal touches, reflecting the solitary life of its occupant. But it was the basement that held the deepest, most chilling secrets. Tucked away in a dimly lit, damp corner, hidden beneath an old, moldering tarp and precarious piles of forgotten lumber and discarded materials, investigators discovered several ancient, decaying cardboard boxes. As the detectives carefully, reverently opened the boxes, a pervasive scent of damp earth, stale metal and aged paper filled the cool, stagnant air. Inside they found a disquieting collection of rusty, forgotten tools, with the shocking discovery of Ethan Ward's diary and the irrefutable DNA evidence. The Oregon Cold Case Unit, under the leadership of Detective Marcus Holloway, could finally piece together the full, horrifying narrative of Rachel Monroe's final hours. The meticulous work of forensic analysts, combined with Ward's chilling written confessions, allowed investigators to dissolve 27 years of agonizing uncertainty, illuminating the dark truth that had long been buried. The truth began with a calculated and deeply unsettling obsession. Ethan Ward, the seemingly unassuming local mechanic, had developed an unhealthy fixation on Rachel Monroe after she brought her green Honda Civic to his shop for routine service just 2 weeks before her disappearance. What appeared to be a mundane professional interaction had for Ward ignited a sinister impulse, a predatory desire that he meticulously acted upon. The investigative reconstruction revealed that on the evening of November 9, 1998, Ward did not cross paths with Rachel by mere chance on a secondary dirt road leading towards the Willamette River. He had deliberately followed her from a distance, patiently stalking her movements after she left the local market, waiting for the opportune moment. On that isolated, unlit stretch of road, a route Rachel often took for its quiet, scenic beauty, unaware of its hidden dangers, Ward, using his mechanical expertise, engineered a scenario designed to isolate her. He discreetly tampered with one of Rachel's tires, creating a slow, insidious leak that would inevitably lead to a flat. When Rachel's car eventually pulled over, the tire hissing its last breath of air, Ward, feigning surprise and concern, emerged from his own vehicle. He approached her, his demeanor carefully constructed to appear helpful, a predatory gesture disguised as genuine kindness. Rachel, caught in a vulnerable position on a deserted road as dusk deepened into night, likely accepted his assistance without a shred of suspicion, believing him to be a good Samaritan. But what began as a deceptive offer of aid quickly devolved into a nightmare of unimaginable horror. As Ward began to work on her tire, Rachel, in a moment that remains unclear in its specific details, but undeniable in its brutality, resisted an advance. It could have been a physical lunge, a terrifying verbal proposition. Regardless, a fundamental boundary was crossed by her assailant. The autopsy's grim findings, the distinct marks of manual asphyxiation, the multiple fractures around her ribcage and wrists, the numerous defensive wounds on her forearms and hands, all corroborated a desperate, intense struggle. Rachel Monroe, gentle and reserved in life, had fought bravely and fiercely for her survival against her attacker. The metallic blue paint fragments found under Rachel's fingernails, once an inexplicable enigma that had confounded investigators for decades, now found their terrifying and undeniable context. Forensic analysis of the minute particles confirmed they were scraped from Ward's tools, from his clothing, and even subtly from the interior of his own vehicle, as Rachel desperately clawed at her attacker during the violent struggle. The blue tarp, in which her body was partially wrapped when discovered, was identified as a common utility tarp. Investigators located receipts for identical tarps in Ward's archived financial records, consistent with the type used for covering tools or equipment, and, more chillingly, for concealing. The DNA profile from the hair under Rachel's nails, the specific chemical signature of the paint, the tarp fibers, each piece of forensic evidence, once disparate and puzzling, now converged into an undeniable, damning narrative that eliminated any shred of doubt about Ward's culpability. Investigators believed Ward had overwhelmed Rachel, forcibly subduing her, before transporting her in his own vehicle to a secluded, unknown location where he held her body for approximately 2 days. The fragmented diary entries, though cryptic, hinted at this chilling interval, speaking of the waiting. He then disposed of her body in the Willamette River, likely weighted down to ensure it remained submerged, only for the river's relentless current and the passage of time to eventually dislodge it, bringing it back to the surface for Gerald Mackenzie to discover. A further, profoundly disturbing revelation emerged from the boxes found in Ward's Idaho basement, the collection of cassette tapes. These weren't merely old music compilations or innocuous recordings. Forensic audio analysis confirmed them to be fragmented, chilling recordings of conversations. They contained muffled voices, some clearly identifiable as female, often marked by growing unease, then palpable fear or outright distress. Investigators quickly concluded that these were recordings Ward had made of potential victims, a deeply unsettling pattern of predatory behavior that painted a far darker, more sinister portrait of the seemingly unassuming mechanic. The audio, though often indistinct, showcased a chilling psychological progression, from casual interaction to veiled threats. While Rachel Monroe was the only murder confirmed in Corvallis, the police now actively suspected Ethan Ward might be linked to 2 other unsolved disappearances in neighboring counties, cases that had gone cold years ago, mirroring the tragic, inexplicable vanishings that had once plagued Corvallis. The discovery of these tapes transformed Ward from a single-victim murderer into a potential serial predator, revealing a chilling history of premeditated targeting and a deeply disturbed psyche. The trial of Ethan Ward for the murder of Rachel Monroe began in September 2025 in a Corvallis courthouse. The courtroom, packed to capacity with media representatives, legal professionals, and members of a community finally seeking closure, buzzed with an electric, somber anticipation. Many faces in the gallery were older, etched with years of unanswered grief. Prosecutor Eleanor Vance, a formidable legal mind known for her meticulous preparation, methodically reconstructed each minute of that fateful November night with surgical precision. She presented the case as a relentless, chronological unraveling of truth, leaving no detail unaddressed. Building an irrefutable mountain of evidence brick by brick, the prosecution team utilized a trove of evidence, both painstakingly re-examined old exhibits and groundbreaking new scientific findings. They projected enlarged photographs of Rachel Monroe, vibrant and smiling in life, juxtaposed with the grim clinical images from the crime scene, forcing the jury to confront the stark reality of her fate. They displayed detailed forensic diagrams, illustrating Rachel's injuries, highlighting the defensive wounds that spoke volumes of her brave, desperate struggle against her attacker. Dr. Eleanor Graves, the forensic analyst, provided compelling, easily digestible testimony on the DNA evidence, explaining the intricacies of mitochondrial DNA and genetic genealogy in layman's terms, leaving the jury with no doubt about the 99.98% match. She meticulously detailed the specific chemical composition of the metallic blue paint fragments, explaining how they perfectly matched paint residue found in Ward's old Corvallis garage, residue that had been meticulously preserved from property transfer records. The paint had come from a set of customized tools Ward had painted blue, Perhaps the most impactful evidence presented was the 3D recreation of the Willamette River crime scene. Using advanced digital modeling and topographical data, the prosecution presented a virtual walkthrough, showing how Rachel's body, entangled in the roots, was discovered. They demonstrated how the current would have carried her, how the blue tarp would have enveloped her, giving the jury a chilling, almost tactile understanding of the brutal discovery. The cassette tapes, too, became a focal point. Brief, unsettling snippets of the audio recordings filled the silent courtroom, the muffled voices of unseen, unknown women, some expressing confusion, others fear. The sounds hinted at the depths of Ward's depravity and the calculated, terrifying nature of his modus operandi. The culmination of the prosecution's case came with the public reading of Ethan Ward's fragmented diary. Prosecutor Vance, her voice clear and steady, held the brittle, water-damaged pages with gloved hands, approaching the jury box with solemn purpose. She read aloud the sentence, its faded blue ink a stark reminder of the crime. She shouldn't have screamed. The words hung in the air, a chilling, visceral echo of Rachel's final terror. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by an immediate, profound silence so absolute it was deafening. Every eye was fixed on Ethan Ward, who sat at the defense table, his face a carefully constructed mask of emotionlessness, though a faint, almost imperceptible tremor could be seen in his tightly clasped hands. Vance then read another fragment from the diary, one that spoke volumes about the killer's cold detachment and a twisted sense of self-pity. The regret mixes with the sound of the water. It was a confession born not of remorse for his actions, but of a perverse inner world, a window into a mind that saw Rachel's death as a consequence of her resistance, rather than his own monstrous, predatory actions. After weeks of testimony, harrowing evidence, and the overwhelming weight of irrefutable scientific and circumstantial evidence, the jury retired to deliberate. Their decision, though anticipated, still landed with immense gravity. On September 27, 2025, precisely 27 years after Rachel Monroe's vibrant life was brutally extinguished, Ethan Ward was found guilty of her murder. He was subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted, not in wild cheers but in a collective, profound sigh of relief, a palpable release of decades of pent-up sorrow, frustration, and a pervasive sense of injustice. Watching the verdict unfold on his television, in the quiet solitude of his living room, was former Sheriff Tom Riley. Now 75 years old, his once dark hair fully white, and his gait less steady, a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. "I never thought I'd live to see justice in this case," he murmured. After nearly 3 decades shrouded in silence, the truth of Rachel Monroe's final moments finally surfaced, dragged from the depths of memory and the cold Willamette River by the relentless march of science and the unwavering persistence of justice. Ethan Ward, a man who believed he had outrun his past by adopting a new name and a new life, was ultimately apprehended, his decades-old secret exposed by a single hair and a microscopic speck of metallic blue paint. His chilling diary, a silent witness to his depravity, delivered the final undeniable proof, echoing Rachel's last desperate scream and revealing the depths of a predator's calculating mind. The labyrinth, once without exit, found its harrowing conclusion, delivering a measure of peace to a community haunted by unanswered questions and a long-deferred justice. This story, like so many others that echo through the corridors of time, reminds us that while darkness may hide, it rarely obliterates. The truth, in its own slow, inexorable way, finds a path, often through the unlikeliest of forgotten details, bringing light to the shadows and voice to the voiceless. Some wounds may never fully heal, but the ache of uncertainty can at last subside when the truth emerges from the waters. Clear and undeniable, Rachel Monroe's story found its justice after 27 years. What for you is the most powerful takeaway from such a long-fought battle for truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to ensure you never miss another journey into the stories after the silence, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell.